It's great to be at the British Council again. It's almost like my second home here in Accra, professionally speaking. Thanks to the Dream Oval Foundation for inviting me, and just as importantly, thank you to Dream Oval for letting me choose my own topic, which is always nice. But I hope it's a topic of interest to you, and the topic is, as you can see up there, the diplomacy in the digital age. It is also, I have to recognise, Friday evening. It's the end of a long week, and so I don't want to bore you by speaking for too long. Instead, I hope to leave a lot of time for questions afterwards, and hope there'll be a few of them. I think, bearing in mind that it is Friday evening, I think you know that we Brits often quote Winston Churchill whenever we make a speech. And here's one of my favourites from him, just before making one of his own memorable speeches, which, like this one, I believe was timed on a Friday evening, just as everybody might in fact prefer to be somewhere else planning their weekend. Churchill said this. He said, "I'm now going to make a speech. It's my job to talk, and it's your job to listen. Let me know if you finish your job before I finish mine." So at the first sign of anybody nodding off or finding their smartphone much more interesting than I am, which is not that hard, I must admit, then I'll cut these opening remarks even shorter, and there'll be time for even more of a discussion. And if everybody dozes off, then, well, I may just turn into a bird and fly away like my dear friend Bishop Obinim. Now, what follows are my views and mine alone, and as such, my views are no more valid or inherently correct than anybody else's. So I'm very happy to be challenged and to be told I've got it wrong. That's what discussion is for. Before getting into the heart of this, maybe first up a few definitions tonight about digital diplomacy. And of course, diplomacy, and I've seen my colleague from Israel, another ambassador here, and we know that diplomacy has existed long before digital diplomacy. So that's a fair place to start. What is diplomacy? Well, diplomacy is how countries do foreign policy, how they do their foreign policy. Fair enough, but then what's foreign policy? Let's go back a step. Foreign policy is simply the strategy of one sovereign state for dealing with other sovereign states and for dealing with the international community. And why do we have a foreign policy? A country has a foreign policy primarily to safeguard its own interests and to achieve shared interests with the rest of the international community. And diplomacy is how they do that. Foreign policy is about managing international relations to achieve your own aims internationally and to achieve shared international goals with others. That's the aim of foreign policy. And diplomacy is simply the way you try and achieve that. And then, therefore, who are diplomats? Like myself, diplomats are the people who do that professionally. And I'm aware there's plenty of less flattering definitions are out there for diplomats as well, like famously the one that said, diplomats are people sent abroad to lie for their country. It's not a concept I personally subscribe to. But if diplomacy then is about the machinery for conducting foreign policy, What about this new concept of digital diplomacy, the title of this talk? What does it mean? Put simply, digital diplomacy is how governments and their diplomats use the internet, smart telephony, and social media as part of managing international relations, again in their own national interest. So that's what we're talking about. And that's important because, frankly, sometimes I say this even as a keen practitioner of diplomacy myself. I think that there has been a tendency to overstate the meaning and importance of digital diplomacy. As a profession, I guess like professions, diplomacy can have a self-obsessed fascination about itself, often while failing to make an impact on others. And similarly, in this field, personally, I think there's been a recent tendency to spend time and navel-gazing about digital diplomacy rather than just doing it and getting on with it. So my point is this: digital diplomacy may be a new form of the art of diplomacy, but it's still diplomacy. It's not something separate from it. Diplomacy, one of the world's older professions, though they say it isn't the oldest profession, that's something else. Diplomacy has essentially always consisted of two parts, the private part and the public part. And private diplomacy, by which I mean confidential, quiet, behind-the-scenes exchanges between governments and off-the-record private conversations diplomats have with leading figures in society, all that still happens, and it's still actually the core and the most important part of what we do. So if I go to see the president or the foreign minister or the leader of the opposition or a key businessman about a prospective commercial deal involving the UK, or if I have an off-the-record discussion with the editor of a newspaper, then what we say to each other remains private. Indeed, much more often than not, even the fact that we've met stays private. You won't find me tweeting about those things. But that confidential, behind closed doors diplomacy has always been complemented by public diplomacy. And public diplomacy means direct, on-the-record communication by governments directly and with of countries to inform them and often to influence them, and sometimes in ways that the governments of those other countries don't like. And public diplomacy has existed for as long as private diplomacy has. The main thesis again tonight is that digital diplomacy is not really utter. It is just the latest form of public diplomacy, though arguably the most public form of it that has ever existed. Similarly, social and digital media may be the latest and most wide-reaching forms of communication ever known, but they are still types of communication, not something wholly new and separate from it. In other words, I'm saying that let's not put digital diplomacy and even social media completely on a pedestal. Individual human beings have always communicated. That's one of the core things that make us human. And as a collective, societies have always engaged in mass communications. So we're not, in fact, talking about something that didn't exist before, namely communication. We're talking about a new form of communication, not something above and beyond it. All that said, the internet, social media, blogging, smart telephony, and so on are qualitatively qualitatively different forms of communication, and that has real consequences for how we use them in diplomacy. And digital technology has certainly disrupted and transformed diplomacy, and most of all, of course, that public part of it, the part we call public diplomacy. Apart from anything, because of social media and the internet, our diplomacy now has to be much quicker, much less formal and rigid, more impactful, more robust in debate with others, and more responsive to those who question it. To paraphrase one of the great gurus on this subject, who is my close friend and colleague, British Ambassador Tom Fletcher, successful digital diplomacy is about three things in our view. Those three things are authenticity, engagement, and purpose. And it's most effective when we manage to achieve all three at the same time. Let me illustrate that by saying that if you meet two out of those three qualities in my job, and those three qualities again are authenticity, engagement, and purpose, if you only hit two out of those three targets, well then you actually may miss the target altogether. Let me explain. For example, if you manage to be authentic and you manage to engage, but without a real purpose, that can be eye-catching, but it may well end up being a bit ephemeral, a bit temporary, and it may end up sounding just like a slogan. But if you manage to add some real purpose, for example, the hashtag #BringBackOurGirls, which was both an awareness raiser and a description of its end goal at the same time, then a digital campaign can create a common aim, a common purpose that goes viral. Against that, of course, we can surely only judge such a campaign a success if we then do actually bring back our girls, something we're sadly still waiting for in this case. So we have to progress more in developing the metrics to know if and how we've actually influenced others, what reach and success we have, and where, and ultimately whether we've actually achieved anything through such campaigns. And more generally, while I'm on that issue, beware of viral hashtag hysterics that may reflect very genuine and widespread concern, but can replace or certainly don't lead to real action. People often and everywhere have short memories. The circus moves on, a new issue takes over public attention. So a social media campaign might be very intense, but only very short-lived, with little account asked for later on by the very people who so enthusiastically took part in the first wave of concern. Real concrete results in diplomacy are often achieved not through public diplomacy, but through the private diplomacy I described earlier. And real results in diplomacy are nearly always the result of long, hard, patient, hours, days, weeks, and months, sometimes years, and not the result of sending out a tweet. So I've spoken about what happens if you manage authenticity and engagement, but you don't have a purpose. Alternatively, what if you have authenticity and a purpose, but no engagement? Well, then you might be transmitting a message without others hearing you, and without you listening to what others think. And a lot of political and business and diplomatic communication can fall into that trap. For me, personally, one of the great things about my own social media engagement is that I end up speaking directly with, or quote unquote engaging with, a lot of quote unquote ordinary people, including people who, quite frankly, didn't necessarily expect to find themselves having a direct conversation with an ambassador or high commissioner. And given that diplomats, particularly ambassadors, have so often, and often for good reason, been regarded as remote and elitist figures living in an ivory tower, I think this ability to have a real-time conversation and to directly answer questions from people who have never interacted with a diplomat before is inherently terrific. It breaks down real or perceived walls. Frankly, it also humanizes my profession. And it's also democratic and transparent as a way for the public to hold diplomats accountable. And remember, diplomats like me are public servants, paid for by the taxpayer, so we should be held to account. In short, social media now allows supposedly ordinary, everyday people to talk more directly to a real person in a position of some relative power and influence. And generally speaking, I think people much prefer that than to speak to a faceless institution or to a brick wall. So that's about authenticity and purpose without engagement. So finally, what happens if you have that engagement? You know what your purpose is, but you speak without authenticity. The danger there is that that just adds up to insincerity. I've often said that while we all make mistakes on social media, and heaven knows I have made and learnt from a few high-profile mistakes of my own, the biggest mistake now is not to be on social media at all. Another mistake is to be on it so infrequently or in such a boring and safe manner as not really to engage with anyone at all. But when it comes to authenticity, another serious mistake in my view is to be on social media but to fake it by trying to be someone you're not. And generally, sooner or later, people will see through a faker. So I always try and be myself and true to myself in my online persona, while also trying to be a good representative of those who employ me. So, for example, if you don't really care about football, you should not pretend that you do, simply as a means of seeming more approachable. Fortunately, as you know, I do like football, and I talk about it a lot, including the fact that West Ham are going to win the Premier League next season. But I don't generally pretend that I like, for example, opera, because I don't. So I don't talk about it or join in debates about it. And incidentally, I'm often asked, and you can ask me here, why do I tweet about things not obviously to do with my work? Sport, music, film, funny cartoons, whatever it is. Well, quite apart from the fact that Britain is incredibly strong in all those categories, since we are global leaders in what is now called soft power, I also happen to think that discussing those things is part of being authentic. I love my work. It's not just my job, it's my vocation in life, but it doesn't totally define me. I have other interests and passions. Certain things make me laugh. I have a work-life balance, and I think it's authentic for people in public positions to show that more personal aspect of themselves from time to time. In short, on social media, but in general, and in digital diplomacy too, it's important to find your own genuine voice, not somebody else's, and to reflect a true you, not somebody else. Of course, I've learned, and I know, there are plenty of pitfalls. I sometimes fall into that myself. I make what I think, and from the British perspective, are light-hearted jokes laced with obvious irony to signpost that fact, but sometimes people take those comments entirely literally and deadly seriously when they were meant in humour. I also bear in mind that it is much easier to share information, which can be done generally very quickly, than to change opinions, which needs perseverance if it's going to work at all. And always remember that everybody is absolutely entitled not to agree with you and absolutely entitled to question you. Thank you for your attention.